So I don't really know where he's going with this. But I'm not sure he's going the correct way, because, you know, the people who make these videos are pretty young. I'm pretty sure the guy who made this video was born after as John Stockton retired, but you never know. But let's see, you know, let's see. We'll add this to the stage. We'll put it there. All right, here we go. Another Jordan highlight. Johnny Arnett.
So fairly recently in the NBA, Chris Paul surpassed Jason Kidd on the NBA's all-time assists list, moving into the second spot all-time. This is an impressive feat, and it's worth appreciating.
Good for Chris Paul, man. Unappreciated, I think, because he switched over a lot of different teams. Didn't stay in one team, so it's rough. But he's, I think he'd gone through a couple of injuries too. It's the era where I didn't really follow past the 2004-05 season, as like I kind of lost taste for the NBA. So
the greatness of Chris Paul and reflecting on just how long he's been making a significant impact on the league. Naturally, after Paul reached this milestone, many younger basketball fans began wondering if he had a shot at reaching the #1 spot. And that's when they realized that it would never happen.
Nope.
As John Stockton has a career total of 15,806 assists.
Well deserved, by the way.
For some perspective, Nikola Jokic has a lower number of points than the number of assists that John Stockton has. As we speak, the gap between Chris Paul and John Stockton is absolutely massive, and in order for Paul to surpass Stockton, he would basically have to maintain his current level of play until he's nearly 50 years old. Just pure insanity. So with this information being...
LeBron James is 4th on that list? Wow. That only tells you how long LeBron James was playing.
Out there in the world, what do you think happened? Do you think younger fans took a moment to appreciate the greatness of John Stockton and respect the fact that he has one of the most unbreakable records in NBA history? Of course not. In typical form for the disrespectful modern fans, they immediately began taking a dump on him as a player, trashing his legacy, ridiculing his competition, and claiming that Chris Paul is the actual all-time assist leader.
Okay, this is where I stopped. This morning when I started to watch this, I didn't see the LeBron James thing because I was listening more than actually watching the video. By the way, bad pause picture before for John. People who don't grow up with players immediately dismiss their careers. They do it. They did it. They're going to do it to Shaquille. They did it to Wilt Chamberlain and Jerry West and Bill Russell and all the greats like Oscar Robertson, Dr. J. It's really hard to appreciate a player if you haven't seen them play. It's happening to Jordan right now. It's going to happen to Kobe, and it's going to definitely happen to LeBron 20 years from now.
Because, quote, Stockton's stats are fake. Just to be clear, this is nothing new for John Stockton, as he's been taking heat from various YouTubers, fans, and modern analysts for nearly a decade at this point. When I first entered the YouTube sphere as a creator, the narrative at the time was that he didn't have a left hand. Although it's true that Stockton used predominantly his right hand, it doesn't take much in-depth searching on YouTube for an honest person to realize that Stockton did in fact have a left hand. The next predominant narrative was that John Stockton was the beneficiary of biased statisticians, as many YouTubers and analysts have claimed that Stockton's assist numbers were artificially inflated by Utah statisticians.
No, they were not. They didn't aim to give Stockton the best assist stats ever, because why? There's no reason to.
Which is why his numbers ended up being so outlandish. And then, the next predominant narrative was that he wasn't all that special of a point guard because he played with Karl Malone, who was one of the major reasons why those assist numbers got so high. Those three negative narratives, the left hand, the fake stats, and the Karl Malone handicap, are the main things I'm dissecting in this video. So sit back and enjoy as we uncover the truth behind the legacy of John Stockton.
All right, let's see.
First off, the left hand. To my understanding, this entire narrative started when a YouTuber by the name of the NBA Storyteller made this video. And in short, his conclusion was basically that John Stockton didn't have a left hand. Allegedly, he couldn't dribble with it, pass with it, drive with it, or even finish with it. At the very least, I respect observant individuals who are able to spot certain trends that others may miss, but also a person who's bold enough to make their claim even if they know they're going to take heat for it in return. That's what the NBA Storyteller did with this video, so I gotta give him credit for that, because the footage tells us that Stockton leaned heavily upon his dominant right hand. The thing is, I think this is a product of the era he played in. Back when Stockton was a young player, defensive players can hand check the ball handler, as they essentially steered the offensive player in the direction that they wanted him to go. Also consider how difficult it is to do stuff like crossover dribbles and various moves with both hands when the defensive player is allowed to be up in your jersey with his hand on you.
Correct.
Naturally, this forces the offensive ball handler to be more protective with the basketball, meaning he would often be backing down a player from the three-point line, and the ball is in his dominant hand as a way to be more secure with the rock.
And pushing away with your less dominant hand, which you don't need to handle the ball with.
This wasn't just
Simple.
something that Stockton did, but it was a regular part of Magic Johnson's game as well.
Yeah.
Then there's extensive footage online of Stockton actually doing work with his left hand. So at the very least, he could use it, but he just didn't use it as often. And here's my last and most significant point about Stockton's left hand, which is essentially, so what if he doesn't have a left hand? So you're trying to tell me that he dominated the game of basketball and became the all-time leader in assists with only one hand? And somehow that makes him less impressive?
That's exactly what I was thinking. Okay, so let's just for the sake of argument say that he doesn't use his left hand. He still did 15,000 assists with one hand, and somehow it's worse? Get the F out of here.
If anything, that just makes me more mesmerized by the skill of his right hand. Listen, currently the NBA's reigning finals MVP is a guy who definitely doesn't have a left hand in his game. At one point, Jaylen Brown was the highest paid player in NBA history,
I don't know
all
who
while
the hell
NBA
that
fans and NBA scouts knew full well that he was incapable of driving left.
Dude, $300 million, it's basically the entire Utah Jazz in the entire salary of the Utah Jazz in 1998 when they lost the finals.
Dribbling left and finishing left with any bit of consistency. For goodness sake, look at how bad he is in this layup drill. Are we positive that John Stockton would have been any worse than this? It's also weird when people act like a player having one single weakness suddenly destroys his entire legacy and credibility. Even the greatest players of all time had weaknesses in their game. For example, Wilt Chamberlain, Shaquille O'Neal, and LeBron James are all liabilities from the free throw line. Guys like Magic Johnson, Steph Curry, and Dirk Nowitzki are subpar defensive players at best. Michael Jordan was a terrible three-point shooter in the first 4 seasons of his career.
Oh, I was going to say a terrible, it wasn't terrible. We discussed this last time we talked about stats on Jordan. He was an just average three-point shooter in an era where the three-point shot was not that important.
I could go on, but the point is that if these weaknesses of these great players don't fully invalidate their legacies, then why should that be the case for John Stockton? Let's get into the next one, the alleged fake stats. The narrative is that Stockton got homebrewed stats for his games in Utah because the biased Jazz statisticians wanted to make their guy look better. Tom Habistro covered some of this when he made his famous critical piece about Michael Jordan's 1988 season. Is there some truth to these home-cooked stats? Possibly.
Before he continues, you can't do it for 82 games because you can only do it in 41 games when you're in the home game, and the local Utah statisticians would increase the value or increase the amount of assists that are taken. It would have leveled off if he wasn't a great assister or basically doing his job as a point guard. But let's continue.
And there's been some examples surfacing online that look pretty damning for Stockton. The thing is, basketball is an imperfect sport, recorded by imperfect people. Not only do I expect there to be mistakes, but I fully expect there to be instances where players are artificially elevated by their supporters. When I did my own video covering Michael Jordan's 1988 season, I found a lot of evidence that specifically some of his steals numbers might have been juiced in some instances. And guess what, guys? I've been doing research for my video about LeBron's assists, which will be dropping next month. And I can promise you in advance that there's some fishiness to his numbers as well. I don't care who the star player is. If you look hard enough, you're always going to be able to find instances where the numbers were inaccurate in their favor.
All right.
So that's the first major part of my point. But the next one is maybe even more important. Let's really delve into these quote home-cooked stats. First off, what you need to know is that there is a different statistician for home and away games. For example, when the
Of course there is. Home game is home game. Away game, it's a different statistician. There's no way they're carrying the same status. But they're bringing their own statistician with them? I don't think so.
Lakers play in Los Angeles, their stats will be tracked by their own statistician. But when they travel to Utah, their stats will be tracked by the Jazz statistician.
Exactly.
And this is why people make the accusations that certain players benefited from home-brewed stats. So let me give you some examples. For LeBron James's career, he averages 7.6 assists per game at home and 7.2 assists per game on the road. So immediately, some of you might be looking at this and assume that there's some shenanigans going on. But the reality is, general NBA players always play better at home.
That's always that was exactly what I was going to say. Home play, like players playing at home where it's comfortable, where it's the crowd is a big component of your game. Unless you're called Michael Jordan and the away crowd just juices you up. By the way, LeBron and Kobe are the same. And Shaq was maybe not. But Karl Malone played way better at home as opposed to away. And if Karl Malone plays better at home, then Stockton is the main guy who benefits from that when it comes to assists. It's not rocket scientist. What am I saying? It's not rocket science. It's not Elon Musk. Come on.
They have the advantage of the home crowd. They're sleeping in their own bed, they're not jet lagged from all the traveling, and they're present with their families in their routines. For a variety of reasons, it only makes sense that the numbers consistently look better at home. So let's look at some other great facilitators. In Magic Johnson's career, he averaged 12.2 assists at home and 11.6 on the road.
Obvious.
Chris Paul has averaged 9.6 assists at home and 9 assists on the road. And then John Stockton averaged 10.9 assists at home and 10.1 on the road. So immediately, the one thing that stands out is that Stockton has the largest discrepancy between home stats and road stats. So maybe there actually is something behind these allegations. But keep in mind that the difference between his gap and Chris Paul's gap is 0.2 assists per game. Not really something that's shaking up the all-time rankings by any significant extent. So let's just assume that we can only go by Stockton's numbers in his away games. If you adjusted his home game averages to be the same as his road numbers, Stockton still would have finished with around 15,190 assists, meaning that even without the home game boost, he would still have a lead over Chris Paul greater than 3,000 assists. It would still be virtually impossible for CP3 to be even close to catching Stockton before he retires. So at the end of the day, this narrative that Stockton is only the leader because of the home-cooked stats is not only stupid, but it's completely asinine to even suggest it. Lastly is the criticism that he's only the NBA's all-time leader because he played alongside of Karl Malone. Well, let me start things off by saying that I don't think anyone is ruling out the fact that Malone obviously boosted Stockton's assist numbers.
Of course
I mean,
he did.
for goodness sake, the mailman was one of the greatest power forwards in NBA history. He was a two-time league MVP, and he's the game's third leading scorer on the all-time list. But to be fair, who is Kobe without Shaq? Who is LeBron without Wade? Who is Magic without Kareem? And who is Michael Jordan without Scottie Pippen? Every all-time great benefited from some significant help. So to pick and
You know, basketball is a team sport, and the ultimate stat that covers a team sport is assists. And usually the guy who makes the most assists is the guy who basically either starts the play or calls the plays on the field. It is absolutely insane to think that a guy who makes a lot of the heavy lifting scoring like Karl Malone did and was what, the fourth or the fifth of all time, because the way the Utah Jazz played to both these guys' strengths. Malone was the big scorer and has a great post-up game coupled with an absolutely great pick and roll move that he did with Stockton. Plus, Stockton knew where to find Malone on the field.
and choose which ones to disqualify is completely unfair unless you do it to the rest of the field as well. In his career, John Stockton and Karl Malone played a total of 19 seasons together. And in that time, there was a total of 10 regular season games where Stockton played without Malone. This was back in the day where NBA superstars played all 82 games with extreme consistency. Regardless of the fact that most of these 10 regular season games were past Stockton's prime, he still managed to average 9.6 assists per game without Karl Malone. This means that if we prorated Stockton's assists without Malone to the rest of his career, he would still have about 14,438 assists, meaning that he would have a lead of 2,300 assists over Chris Paul, even without his greatest offensive weapon. So basically, the dumb
That last stat was a complete fabrication because they went with the season he wasn't with Malone and then doubled it through for 19 years. It's a bit of a stretch, okay? It's really fudging the numbers and making a whole different number. I don't believe in what if. The fact of the matter is he did play with Karl Malone, and the fact of the matter is Stockton was a consistent player, meaning not only does he have a very long career, he had a long career where he consistently played 82 games, meaning he played the entire season plus most times I think he played in the playoffs as well. It doesn't really matter because playoffs don't really count. He played a full season. He wasn't injured a lot, and if he did, he didn't play 4 or 5 games, and then he got back on the saddle. So he was a very consistent player. Wasn't injured a lot. Same goes with Karl Malone. No major injuries that I can remember. Probably 1 or 2 that didn't probably affected the whole Utah Jazz, but didn't affect Stockton's play because there are other players to pass the ball to.
narratives that are constantly regurgitated about Stockton are just that, extremely dumb false narratives. If you ask me who Stockton was, he was simply one of the top 2 greatest passers in the history of the game. He wasn't an explosive scorer by any means, but he was very efficient in his contributions, and was always a threat from 3-point range.
Yep.
He was an all-time great defensive player, and I'm just now mentioning that he's the game's all-time leader in steals as well, and by a country mile. He wasn't a flashy player by any means. He was smooth and methodical. He was extremely smart and safe with the basketball, as he had an incredible assist-to-turnover ratio. He was a master of angles, anticipation, and communication. He was nowhere close to being considered as an athletic freak. But like other greats in the modern NBA, like Nikola Jokic, Luka Doncic, and Chris Paul, John Stockton didn't need to be, as he was fundamentally sound, skilled, and just understood the game better than 99% of the guys within the league. Sure, he made it to the NBA Finals twice and never won a single championship.
Because of
But
Jordan.
that's nobody's fault other than Michael Jordan. Literally, nobody's fault other than Michael Jeffrey Jordan,
Yeah.
who kept a lot of all-time greats from winning championships.
Three names that are on the list of all-time Hall of Famers remembered for their game, their contribution to the game, and being a massive sort of name that is recognized. One is Charles Barkley, and the 2 others are Karl Malone and John Stockton. And they all fell to the great one.
Stockton led his Jazz to beat a Rockets 3-headed monster of Olajuwon, Barkley, and Drexler. And before you say it was because they were old, newsflash, the Bulls and Jazz were
Exactly. Karl Malone, John Stockton, and Jeff Hornacek were the same age as the other trio.
basically just as old. Stockton also helped lead his Jazz to defeat the Lakers super team in 1998, who had 4 NBA All-Stars like Shaq, Kobe, Eddie Jones, and Nick Van Exel. This was a Lakers team that many people expect.
I told this on a different video, but I was rooting for the Jazz in 1998 because a good friend of mine was a massive Jazz fan, and he loved the Stockton and Malone duo. And I do love Stockton. I always loved Stockton as a player because, I can identify with him. He's a small guy. He's a white guy, not necessarily because he's white, but he's a white guy that played with really big guys, and he wasn't really athletic. He was thin, he was fit, he was in good shape, but he wasn't like athletic like you would think an athletic guy. He wasn't a flyer and all that stuff, but the thing is, he was not afraid to penetrate to the basket. And the few highlights you see on the screen really tells it. He was not afraid of anybody. He picked fights. When people pushed him around, he picked fights and he went all out.
Expected to represent the West in the 1998 NBA Finals. And even the Lakers themselves made some of those claims throughout that season.
I've seen
And
that series, by the
Stockton
way,
was the
live.
floor general for
And
the
it was a
team that
dagger in
beat
my
that
heart.
squad. You can say that Stockton didn't have a left hand, that he had weak competition, and he had a superstar forward that made him look better than he actually was. You're free to have whatever opinion you want. But, you know who I'm listening to the opinion of? The guy who's arguably the greatest defensive point guard in the history of the game, Gary Payton. This is a guy who can...
People keep saying that, and I love Gary Payton. I've seen him play on both on the Sonics and that one season on the Lakers. He's a great defensive player. I would not put him as the best defensive player of all time. I think I would give it to Jason Kidd or maybe Steve Nash. I still not sure. Plus the fact that I really love Stockton and the fact that Stockton is the all-time steals leader. I can't give it to Gary. I love Gary. I love his work. He's a great defensive player. He's a great player, but he's a great defensive player. But I wouldn't put him as the all-time greatest defensive player of all time. No.
competed with Magic Johnson, guarded Michael Jordan in the NBA Finals, guarded Kobe Bryant in the NBA playoffs. And he's also a guy whose career overlapped with Dwayne Wade and LeBron James. So he's a defensive legend who's been a part of all kinds of amazing
He is a
eras.
defensive legend, yeah.
And you know who he says is the most difficult player he's ever had to guard? That's right, John freaking Stockton.
Yep.
So based on all that, if he indeed doesn't have a left hand after all, well then I guess his right hand might just be the greatest right hand in the history of basketball.
All right. I enjoyed that video a lot. Oh, here we go. Let me see. That was great. That was great. One of my favorite players of all time. Too bad he didn't play in any of the teams that I particularly like. And you know what's weird with John Stockton? The weird part of John Stockton, he came from this, I think from Gonzaga, which is a very small little university or college or whatever.
Scrolling through the trash, can't believe my eyes. Worthless vids, man, no surprise. Stupid thumbnails, faces all deranged. Looking for gold, all I find is strange.